thank you, Dr. Edwards, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'd like to start today with a pair of quotations. The first is from somebody whom I believe should be familiar to some of you. This is a quotation from my son Arthur a couple of years ago, from before I actually started conducting this research. This reflects his initial experimentations with large, exaggerated numbers. And as you can see, he's not only a very clever little boy, but he's very inventive once he discovered that the morpheme Ilion was productive. The second quotation is from Nick Clegg, age 43. A British politician who is familiar probably to many of you, and this was a quotation he made during a prime ministerial debate in 2010, where he referred to billions and squillions of pounds, commenting on the need for fiscal restraint in the healthcare sector. In the first case from Arthur, we have a highly inventive use of phonological patterning. In the second case, though, Clegg was ridiculed by the British press for using a made-up number, squillion. This was mocked as childlike, and it was a sign some held of him being economically inept, out of touch. So my goal today is to reflect on these two quotations through a detailed study of words of this form. My goal is to examine words, indefinite hyperbolic numerals, or IHN as I'll sometimes call them, which are basically words like zillion or jillion or umpteen, and examine them in a linguistic and historical context. And after I outline some basic linguistic issues, I'll identify two different categories, minor and major. I'll take you through some key milestones. But really the question is, why are there so many IHN in English? Why did they emerge when they did and how they did? And what's the range of variation? I'm then going to take you through their later history up to the present day and include some work from my present research at the Math Corps program here at Wayne State. All right, so first, what are indefinite hyperbolic numerals? Well, basically, they sound like numerals phonologically. They behave like numerals morphosyntactically, but they're not part of a number sequence referentially. In other words, they look like numbers, they sound like numbers, they combine with other numbers in regular or patterned ways, but they have no definite reference. They're not on the number line. One can't answer how many zeros are in a zillion. In discourse, pragmatically, they're used where a numeral might be expected, but where the speaker's goal is hyperbolic. That is, to exaggerate while remaining indefinite. Now, here we see that IHN do indeed behave like the numerals after which they're patterned. So as you can see, zillion is patterned after billion, bajillion might be patterned after billion, and you could say bajillions, but you can't say, acceptably, something like zillion thousand, in the same way that you can't say billion thousand. This is irregular and would be judged by most listeners to be marked at the very least. So this is one of the ways we recognize indefinite hyperbolic numerals, is that they combine with other numerals, or that they're patterned in the same way that an ordinary numeral might be. Now, I want to contrast that with another set of words, which are indefinite hyperbolic quantifiers. And these are words in English like loads, scads, heaps, oodles, but these are not IHN because they don't behave like numerals. You can't say 6 oodles. Either there's oodles or there aren't oodles. You can't have 6 oodles, but you can clearly have 6 zillion. And while you can say things like 6 loads, that can only be taken as having a definite reference. If you say 6 loads, that means something very different than saying loads and loads. 6 loads means that there are 6 of something, which are loads. Now, another thing going on here is that almost any numeral can be used hyperbolically. And Eva Lavrich has been doing some interesting research on the way that people use numbers in a hyperbolic sense. So we could say we're open 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. It's clearly not meant to be understood literally. we can say, oh, I've told you a million times, stop that. Put your toys away, Arthur, or whatever. And clearly it's not meant literally, it's meant hyperbolically. But in contrast, IHN have no definite reference whatsoever. The only reference they have is this indefinite meaning. And this is important because in discourse, sometimes when you're using a definite numeral, you have to be careful to make sure they don't understand, that your listener doesn't understand you literally. And that requires a common understanding of what is a reasonable amount of time to ask someone to put their toys away. In this case, using an IHN, you don't have to worry about it. The reference is always indefinite. Now, IHN are actually cross-linguistically quite rare. They're not unknown outside English, but they are quite rare. So in Aristophanes and Eupolis in ancient Greek, there's this term psalmakosioi, which basically means sand hundred. And it's structured in the same way as the other hundreds, diakosioi, triakosioi, etc. Similarly, some of the modern Romance languages have such phrases, tropecientos, or in Spanish, fantastiglione in Italian. These are actually very, very rare and quite recent, as far as I can tell, although there's more research to be done. But in fact, a language does not need indefinite hyperbolic numerals. It's quite possible to do without them. And so, for instance, I've not been able to find any such numeral in French. So in French, what you have is an idiomatic use of 36, 36, which is a definite number, obviously, which is used in a hyperbolic way. So it's understood that it's not to be meant. If you say 36, it doesn't always mean 36. Sometimes it just means an awful lot. So what I'm going to be doing today is using a historical sociolinguistic approach to examine English indefinite hyperbolic numerals. I'm compiling early instances of each, but this is more than just mere lexicography. I want to place each indefinite hyperbolic numeral in its social and historical context. And by doing this, I'm able to show that indefinite hyperbolic numerals are not just made up. They're not just random. That they are informal, they are vernacular, but they emerge in patterned and structured ways that are very interesting, and that tell us a lot about what they're for and what they do discursively. Ultimately, what I want to know is why, in the late 19th and early 20th century, so many indefinite hyperbolic numerals were added to the lexicon of American English particularly. I want to know the why and the where and the when, and by comparing and contrasting, I'm going to look at the nature of numeration in general in late 19th and early 20th century America to address this question of why so many words would be added to this lexicon where there had been none previously. So to do this, I used a lot of digital text corpora, digital archives, and so essentially I've used all of these sources and looked through them all systematically for anything that I thought was an indefinite hyperbolic numeral, that looked like an indefinite hyperbolic numeral, that might be an indefinite hyperbolic numeral, and so on. Of course, one can never exclude the possibility that there are more out there. In fact, there clearly are more out there that I haven't found. But doing this sort of digital text searching is really the only reasonable way to proceed. Of course, methodologically, this excludes what's not digitized. That's just a necessary feature of this sort of research. Secondly, like all historical sociolinguistics, it largely excludes spoken language, except where it's been transcribed or written down. And so there's a bias in there. And because I recognize that a lot of IHN emerged in a spoken context, there is an unknown history to these that has yet to be fully identified and may not be identifiable. Now, as I said, I'm going to identify two classes of English IHN, and I'm just going to call these minor and major. Minor IHN are the numbers 4011, umpty, steen, and umpteen. And these are earlier. They mostly emerge in the period 1840 to 1890, and particularly from 1880 to 1890. and they're generally less hyperbolic. So for instance, it's a little unusual to say there are umpteen stars in the sky. Umpteen doesn't sound high enough to be the number of stars in the sky. In contrast, to say there are a zillion stars in the sky sounds much more correct, more plausible as hyperbole. And so this major category of IHN are simply called major because they're larger, because it is assumed that they're larger, because they're patterned after million, billion, trillion, and not after teens or something, or t, which suggests that their numbers less than 100. And these are also later, that they largely emerge from 1900 to 1930. So the first thing I had to do is track these things down. And so this table summarizes all of the IHN that I've been able to find that have been used with any sort of regularity. And as you can see, I've found 22 of them. I've distinguished the two categories numerically so that you see that the minor categories are the ones in blue, and the major ones are the one in pink. Or orange, I suppose it looks a little more like. As you can see, the OED is very bad at covering the body of IHN. Other dictionaries are no better. The American Heritage is quite bad. Even DARE, the Dictionary of American Regional English, really only deals with the big ones. And so a lot of the variability in IHN is essentially invisible as lexicography stands right now. So for me, the first task was to actually find these things. But of course, the one thing that you can see is that with the one exception of squillion, all of the IHN, the minor IHN are early, and all of the major IHN are late. You'll also see that with one exception, which is the bazillion, I've antedated all of these, sometimes by several decades. That's not so important, but it's been a part of this project going forward. So let's start with 4011. 4011 is sort of a weird one, because it's really so very early. And this is the earliest example I've been able to find from the Universalist Union, the Universalist religious magazine newspaper. And in both these examples, the one from the Universalist Union and the one from Richards, we see that there is an informality to these quotations, that there's a use of I dialect, for instance, the use of the word cigar instead of cigar. That is a phonetic representation of the word that's meant to be implied. 4011, however, is not in quotations in any of these. And the fact that these are not in quotations actually is meaningful. It tells us that probably somebody was already using these well before 1839. One can understand it even if one's never heard it before, but as we'll see, in other cases, the first instances in print actually explain what the word is meant to be, explains that it's indefinite and hyperbolic. And the fact in these cases that it doesn't suggests to me that actually what's going on here is that this is actually quite a bit earlier. Now, interestingly enough, 4011 was an object of some discourse by early linguists and lexicographers, starting with Maximilien Schele de Vere in 1872, in which he described it as a ludicrously slang term, possibly of Negro manufacture. This attribution was then picked up by several authors thereafter, with less and less qualification. So to the point by 1889, it was of Negro origin. What's really interesting to me is that there's no evidence whatsoever that this is actually correct. There's absolutely no evidence of it having an African-American origin, and in fact there's some counter-evidence. So James Russell Lowell, who's a noted abolitionist, whose the Bigelow Papers was sort of a send-up of contemporary white attitudes towards slavery, towards the Civil War. In 1862, he presented this quote. This is not an actual quotation, but rather it's a satirical letter written by his invented interlocutor, who goes by the name of Bird of Freedom Sawin. And Bird of Freedom Sawin was a white northerner who had joined the Confederate cause in this artificial story. And Lowell includes 4011 as part of his talk. This actually suggests that 4011 does not have any sort of connection with African American English, other than the fact that in this object of discourse, the purpose of the Bigelow Papers was to directly address the question of slavery, and that Bird of Freedom Sawin is a notorious racist in presenting this evidence. So there's absolutely no evidence, but it sort of became racialized throughout the 1870s and 1880s as lexicographers picked up on it. Now I want to talk about Steen, which is probably unfamiliar to most of you because it's been obsolete for the best part of a century. And Steen originated as an emphatic form, which is basically a short form cut off at the front of the word 16. But it doesn't mean 16. It's basically just a short form that is an indefinite hyperbolic numeral. And what's very interesting here is these are the first 7 instances. This is not a selection. This is not a sample. These are the first 7 instances of Steen that I've been able to find. And all of them come from a very, very narrow genre, which is collegiate newspapers and magazines from 1882 to 1884. This to me is actually very strong evidence that it actually is no earlier than this, because they come so quickly that it really suggests that this was a word invented in 1882, 1881, maybe 1880, but no earlier. Really in this one context of collegiate vernacular. It later spread out. These are certainly playful. I'm very, very happy to have the third quotation. O Steen, most apt expressive Steen, I love thee as thou art. I would not have thee back again with 6 thy previous part. It goes on like that for several verses. It's really quite terrible. But actually the really important thing about this quotation is it was published in the Michigan Argonaut, which is the digital copy I have, but it was actually originally in Acta Columbiana, which is the Columbia University magazine. So this is a discourse community. They're cooperatively engaging, sharing information back and forth, and reading each other's papers. And this is where Steen originates, in this place and in no other place. Now, umpteen. Umpteen is a word that has a long history in English, but also which has been addressed by several linguists over the years. It's the only one of the minor class of IHN to survive to this day. Eric Partridge, who's the well-known lexicographer of wartime slang, has argued that this is British in origin around 1916, and he argued it originated as Royal Air Force airman slang. And his explanation is that umpty-ump is meant to be an imitative of dots and dashes in Morse code. Regardless of the specific nature of that claim, it's certainly not British in any way. Here we have from the Brooklyn Eagle back in 1883, and I have several other instances from the mid-1880s and throughout the 1890s. All are American. In fact, the very earliest one I have in Britain is from 1917, which actually gives us a very clear idea of how it got into RAF airman slang, which was through contact with Americans during the First World War. This one's just a little piece of fun. This is from the Delphos, Ohio Herald. What I find notable about it is it's extremely inventive. This is an ad, and basically J.J. Kelly, the proprietor of the Delphos Steam Die Works, has said that you really ought to know that after Junember 41st, 1811, then nobody's going to be able to come into my business. So you better get down there right now And then it's, whereunto I've set my hand this 41st day of September 1984. I was a little puzzled by this because it's extremely surreal, but then I realized that the date, February 28th, 1896, is the day before a leap day. So actually what's going on here is he's actually reflecting on the fact that there's one of these weird days coming up tomorrow. It's a very obscure little thing, but I just sort of love it. All right, moving along. Turning to the major class, because much to my surprise, once I got started into this, there's a very early example of the word squillion, Nick Clegg's word for which he was excoriated. This is a debate between two young boys over marbles. And you can see in it also the characteristics of children's speech as imagined or as transcribed by adults. Bet your million, billion, squillion dollars taint. This is what's known as I dialect among linguists. It's a written representation of the way that somebody is thought to speak phonetically. The next good example I have, or the next sure example I have, is from 20 years later, from 1898. But from the proceedings of the Iowa State Dairy Association, no less. But it similarly attributes squillion as being the language of children. 1,000, 100, billion, million, squillion, more or less. And from 1878, the first instance, to 1913, squillion is the only indefinite hyperbolic numeral of the major class. So I have 10 or 12 of these. They all say squillion. And all of them, adults are writing in emulation of children's speech. So one possibility is that this actually was in children's speech from 1878 till 1913, and that this squillion was just a children's word. I don't actually think this is very likely because of what I think we actually observe, which is that when children discover that there are such things as millions and billions, they're very inventive in the same way that Arthur was. The fact that squillion is the only word that they use actually suggests that this is a form of adult discourse in emulation of the way that it was thought children might talk, but not actually reflecting in an actual children's dialect word. Of course, most children's actual talk is not well preserved, so we don't know this for certain, but the fact that squillion and only squillion appears again and again and again suggests that what's going on here is this is a part of a discourse genre in which squillion is a way of attributing this sort of inventiveness to kids without it being actual examples of speech. In the 1920s, squillion is joined by skillion. Skillion is near and dear to my heart because it's the only indefinite hyperbolic numeral that originates in Canada. And two of the first three instances are actually Canadian. And I actually think there's a reasonable case to be made that this might in fact be a variant of squillion that originates in Canada, although certainly I have later instances of it that are American. But, and we later see it, for instance, in this. This is the comic strip writer Gene Burns, who's well known for his very famous comic Regular Fellers, used skillions quite a bit, and this example is from the Oakland Tribune from the 1930s. I think the thing about skillion and squillion that is most notable, first of all, of course, is that they're so early. And squillion is the only 19th century major IHN. And I think that they're just variants of one another, which is established by their early date and their common context. These are the numerals that are being used to describe children's speech. But now I'm going to take you into some other IHN and show you how it can be quite different. So let's talk about zillion. This is one of the earliest examples of zillion. Here, it's an example from the Chicago Defender, an African-American newspaper from a correspondent, a Los Angeles-based correspondent, Ragtime Billy Tucker. Here you see that zillion is being used quotatively. It's being used with quotations. And this suggests that there's at least some awareness that it's new and interesting. There's actually another really interesting and important feature of this, which has nothing to do with zillion, which is the fact that this is an example of the use of the term Big Apple to refer to Los Angeles rather than New York. And this is because at this point in time, the term Big Apple could actually be used to refer to any large city, and it only became exclusive to New York after some time. There's been actually quite a lot of research done on this article because it's one of the places where it's very clear that the Big Apple is LA and not New York for Ragtime Billy Tucker. Here's the next one, which is, this is from The Messenger. The Messenger was the cultural and literary heart of the Harlem Renaissance and was a central literary magazine for African Americans not only in New York but in the entire Northeast. And this quotation comes from Theophilus Lewis, who was a theater critic at that point when Lou Leslie makes $1 zillion out of From Dixie to Broadway. But it's important to note that these two examples of zillion, the one from Tucker and the one from Lewis, this is not childlike speech. This is not an emulation of anything that is meant to be even rural or rustic. Lewis is obviously an exceedingly erudite reader. The word, the prevailing style of the castle, which will contain 500 spacious rooms, will be Renaissance. But the north wing will show a decided Moorish influence with slender minarets. This is highly educated, elite-oriented African-American English. And so while this is African-American English, and while it is vernacular, it is not African-American vernacular English as it's typically used. This is something else. So between 1916 and 1939, I've tracked down 55 instances of the word zillion. 39 of these occur in African-American publications or in context that clearly indicates that what is being referred to is something to do with African-Americans. So for instance, there's another theater review from a predominantly white newspaper in which it's referring to an African-American production where somebody is described as being a zillionaire in this play. 16 occurrences occur in non-African-American contexts. So that is to say, this is not an exclusively African-American word, but at a level very, very much higher than chance, it is associated with a specific discourse community. The discourse community of educated, literate, newspaper and magazine reading African Americans who are sharing a common language. Zillion is the IHN of choice for this community. So we don't find squillion. We don't find jillion, which I'll talk about in a minute. Zillion is the IHN that's being used in this community. There are certainly other examples. For instance, the earliest one, the 1916 example, is from a non-African American publication. So my argument is not that it emerged in some sort of African American context, but it became used and associated with that context over time. Now let's move on to jillion. This is the first instance of the word jillion I've been able to find, and it's wonderful. A cowboy said the word jillion. He said that anybody could count a million. A jillion meant more than could be counted. I reckon so. I had not been in Texas long enough to argue with the cowboy, especially one who seemed to be on mathematics. Now this is from the Miami News, from Miami. But what's important is that this was a report made from Texas by Stephen Singleton. It was a conversation that took place in San Antonio, which was the place from which Singleton was reporting. And as you can see, as with the first zillion, the first jillion is also quotative. Here's another example, and I apologize if you can't see it very well. This is from the Port Arthur News about 10 years later. And Port Arthur is near Houston along the Texas coast. And you can see that here it's being used in advertising in a non-quotative way to advertise new frocks tailored and dressy. So here I have a map, and I hope that it's visible. I found 122 instances of Jillian between 1928 and 1939. 115 of them occur in a highly delimited area that we're seeing here. Texas and immediately adjacent areas, as seen in this map. The tags indicate the number of instances, and the ones with stars are simply ones that have 10 or more instances. So that's Dallas, Lubbock, and San Antonio. But what I want you to pay attention to is actually, let's see if I can actually, it's okay. That you can see up in, we have 6 in Emporia, Kansas. We have 5 in Big Spring, Texas. We have 6 in Clovis, New Mexico. These are small communities. This is not a primarily urban usage. This is a small town usage, and the fact that there's a lot in Dallas actually has a lot to do with the fact that Dallas newspapers are very well digitized, and we have a very good record of them. And of course, a lot of the events being reported on from Dallas actually have to do with other rural and small town communities. We can also track its spread chronologically. I won't talk too much about this chart, but basically this is just every 2 years from 31 to 39, the cumulative total of the number of Jillians that are from each state. And as you can see, the vast, vast majority of them are from Texas, New Mexico, and Kansas, and Oklahoma, and then just 1 or 2 from any other place. And most of those 1s or 2s, you actually see the one from Alabama is only 1939. The one from Arizona, 1939, DC. So actually what you can see here is actually a geographic dispersal from a central place in Texas and Oklahoma, Texas and the Southern Great Plains, outwards. So I think this is quite notable and suggests that just as Zillion is the IHN associated with literate African American English, Jillian is the IHN associated with Texas and other allied Englishes of the Southern Great Plains. A further point of contrast between Zillion and Jillian are its collocations, that is to say, the words with which it's associated, in particular what it's being used to count. And as you can see, Zillion and Jillian, and also the variant spelling Jillian with a G, I've included those 2 together, those are both from Texas. Dollars are counted quite frequently by both, and people are counted quite frequently by both. But we see some distinctions. So for instance, vermin and products are only counted using Jillian. So for instance, if you want to count mosquitoes or black flies or bats, then you count it, then Jillian was being used. This was not, this is to say that in this discourse community, not only are there chronological associations, but there are expectations about what can be counted. In fact, I think the most notable at all is that no products are ever counted using Zillions. That it's not ever used in advertising in any sense, but it's used very, very frequently in the case of Jillian with a J or G. This is statistically significant. If you want the data, I have it available. So, here's our contrast. Zillion is urban and African American at an overwhelmingly high level. Jillian is small town Texas and Southern Great Plains at an extremely high level. And also in terms of collocations, there are some similarities, but also some key differences. This suggests that there are 2 distinct discourse communities using 2 distinct indefinite hyperbolic numerals throughout the period. This is for the period leading up to and including 1939. Why do I stop there? Well, starting in 1938 and until his death in 1946, the author Damon Runyon began to use both Zillion and Jillian, and only those 2, both in his newspaper columns and his literary stories. Runyon's material was, of course, widely available. Virtually every newspaper in America printed something from Runyon. Certainly if you were a Hearst newspaper, then Runyon was in there. Runyon used them interchangeably and was devoid of any ethnic or regional association. Now, Runyon is a treasure trove for people who are interested in American dialectology, because he was extremely attentive to uses that might not be available or that might not be familiar to English speakers. He familiarized everyday Americans in other regions with dialectal uses of specific areas. And the effect of Runyon was essentially to establish both Zillion and Jillion as part of general informal American English, divesting them of their original contextual associations with specific regions or specific discourse communities. By doing this, Runyon did a service to Americans by giving them two great new words. But he did a disservice in that, to this day, the OED still reports Runyon as the first citation for Zillion. So it makes it appear as if Runyon invented these words, when in fact what he was doing was something quite different. And here we have a couple of examples, one from 38 from the Nevada State Journal, one from 39 from the Zanesville, Ohio Signal, where Runyon is using one or the other entirely interchangeably. And he used about 10 or 12 examples of Zillion and Jillion in sort of the years between 38 and 46. Now, why do IHN emerge? I promised you an answer. Well, in the 1970s, Roger Westcott suggested an origin for Zillion, which he called Zazification. And Zazification, I know, linguists were all a little touched in the head, I know. So my apologies. Yes, especially. But Westcott's theory was essentially that American English slang was characterized by the use of the letter Z and the phoneme Z as replacement for other words. So if you replace the B in billion with a Z, you get Zillion, which is a slang term. I don't deny that it's a phonological alteration. That's self-evident. But it's not an explanation, because it certainly doesn't explain any of the other 21 indefinite hyperbolic numerals. But it also doesn't explain anything about the context. Why did so many IHN emerge so rapidly when there were none prior to the 1840s? And really, only 4011 existed prior to the 1870s. Why did so many emerge all in America in these various social contexts? This requires some explanation. So the first place I turned was to the linguistic evidence. This is a chart from the Google Ngram viewer of the frequency of the word billion in American English from 1850 to 1930. And as you can see, it's fairly flat until about 1890, at which point there's an inflection point, and it rises very rapidly thereafter. So between 1890 and 1930, the frequency of billion in written American English increased 10 times. Similarly, for trillion, you see a fairly flat rate from 1850 to 1890, again followed by an inflection point. In this case, it's about 4 times as common as it was in 1890 in 1930. And frequency is interesting. Frequency is good data, but it's not analysis. It does not tell us what this means or why we should care. What else do we know? Well, what I just established, that IHN all originate in North American Englishes, not British or other Englishes. But they emerge in clusters, that they're really, really very rapid, and most of them emerge either between 1880 and 1890 for the minor, 1915 to 1930 for the major. That other than squillion and skillion, which I don't really think are children's speech at all, this is not simple playfulness on the part of kids that somehow gets picked up by adults. That these occur in a variety of discursive contexts where informal reference to a large quantity is needed or desired. So the question we really need to be asking is, why use IHN at all? when other options, such as indefinite quantifiers like oodle or loads, have been available and widespread for a long, long time. Why even bother? You don't need IHN. Well, my theory here is a discursive pragmatic one. The first part of this is that they emerge in a context in which numerical reference was becoming metalinguistically preferable to non-numerical reference. That is to say, in which if you have an opportunity to use a numerical reference, it was socially valued for you to do so. And the historian Patricia Klein-Cohen, in her book A Calculating People, argues that the 19th century in particular marked a flowering of numeracy in mid-19th century America. That is, whereas in the Revolutionary period, numerical information, quantitative information, statistical information was not seen as relevant, by the mid-19th century, Americans started to see this as an essential way by which information not only could be conveyed, but ought to be conveyed. And high numbers, in particular, in this framework, became an index of educational level. And thus, they became suitable for co-optation. You co-opt this sequence, billion and trillion, for your own purposes, for informal purposes, for jocular purposes, for satirical purposes, and make it into what it became, which is part of specific discourse communities. The second piece of information integrates the linguistic and the social, which is that the expansion of education, and particular public education in the 19th century, led to increasing familiarity with the fact that there was a pattern, that it goes million, billion, trillion. And where there's knowledge of that pattern, you have the opportunity for inventiveness. And I think it's interesting to note that in British English, this pattern does not exist to the same degree. Because in British English, the word for 1,000 million is a milliard. And the word for that we would call, that North American English speakers would call trillion is what's called billion in British English. That's less so now, but certainly in the 19th century that was overwhelmingly the case. So the pattern was thus slower to emerge in Britain, and it was less common outside of American English, and thus it was harder to replicate or emulate through the use of indefinite hyperbolic numerals. I'm very quickly going to move through the set of intensifiers, ba, ga, and ka, each of which can combine with zillion or jillion. The forms with zillion, in each case, emerge before the forms with jillion. So bazillion is earlier than bajillion, and kazillion is earlier than kajillion. But also, forms with zillion are more frequent than the forms with jillion in each case. They're just more common numerically. These are, with one exception, very, very late, 1970 to 1990. So the one exception is here, from the New York Times, where the word bazillion is in an ad from 1939. I find this very weird, and I don't know what the explanation is, but I'm looking into it. But most of them are quite a bit later. This is the first example of the word gazillion, which is from an ad for a college theater production of how to succeed in business without really trying. And as you can see, it's very graphically inventive. So they've somehow skipped billion and gone from million to trillion to gazillion to loads. But most of the instances of these intensified indefinite hyperbolic numerals are very, very late, 70s, 80s, even 90s. And here we see it laid out. This is just to show that phenomenon I described, that there is a pattern to these. These are not random usages. In each case, the form with a Z is by many times more common than the form with a J. This again refutes the idea that these are somehow random inventions that kids are making up and that somehow this just gets picked up. There's actually a structure to this that is deserving of our attention. So we've come to near the end, but to come to the end we have to get to the beginning, or at least where the project started for me. Over the past 3 years, I've been doing an ethnographic project with the Wayne State Math Corps program. And I do classroom observation and I do interviews with students and staff, but mostly African American youth between the ages of 12 and 17. And on my very first day at Math Corps, I encountered the following piece of classroom discourse where the teacher says, and this one's in the trillions family, all right, here's my question. Tell me tomorrow what comes after trillions. And a male student who I'll call Keyshawn says quietly under his breath, zillions. And then the teacher hears that and says, tell me tomorrow, okay? The point is never returned to, but it piqued my attention that this was the case. I later realized that this was important as I started to interview students, and I started to ask the question, what's the biggest number you can think of? So I certainly, without prompting, what I found was very, very many of the students, I have 15 of the students I interviewed, unprompted, said, well, that there is a number called a zillion. And so Charlene, who's a highly, highly advanced math student, says 999 zillion, 999 trillion, and so on, and 3/4. Then I laugh, and then she says, oh, wait, 0.99999. But the point is, first of all, that for these students, zillion is a real number. But it's more than that, because it's a real number with a very specific meaning for all of them. Zillion is the next one after trillion. Zillion isn't after million, zillion isn't after billion. They don't have quadrillion and zillion somewhere higher than that. Zillion has a very definite place on the number line for some of these students. And that to me is very notable. So at least for some speakers, zillions has become a definite numeral. There is consensus that it follows trillion. Nobody at Math Corps has ever said jillion or bajillion or any other form of indefinite hyperbolic numeral. So one possibility is that it's dialectal. Maybe it's related to African American vernacular English. Maybe it's some sort of weird retention of the old association of zillion with African American publications. I don't know. It may be youth related. And certainly more investigation would be needed. I'd certainly want to talk to non-African American youth and see if they also share this same intuition that zillion follows trillion. One possibility is that there's a hair braiding technique called zillions, and the sociolinguist Geneva Smitherman, who's of course a Wayne State alum and is up at MSU, has identified this as this zillions as a particular piece of African American English. She doesn't talk about it as a number being linked to African American English. But I think that this is a possibility that deserves some further attention. Now this may seem weird that a number like zillion would take on a definite reference, but it's not unheard of. So here are some cross-linguistic examples. That ancient Greek myrios was originally a word meaning countless and immense, and then only later took on the definite term, the definite reference meaning 10,000. And similarly, the old Egyptian chech originally meant a multitude or countless, and then later got added into the Egyptian number system as the number meaning 1 million. So it's not unusual, although it's certainly not inevitable, for this to be a strategy by which one can form new powers of a base, of a number system. If you have an indefinite numeral, then it then takes on the qualities of definiteness over time. The degree to which this is true cross-linguistically is unknown, but obviously I'm looking into this quite extensively. For fun, I'd like us to consider the possibility that 3 could be an indefinite hyperbolic numeral. As we know, there are some languages where there are no number words higher than 2 or higher than 3, and quantifiers often get used to refer to higher quantities. It's possible that this is a strategy by which this category of quantifier versus the category of numeral get blurred. And what exactly counts as a quantifier and what exactly counts as a numeral is not entirely clear in this case. This is from XKCD, a popular webcomic which you all should be reading. So to wrap up, English IHN are not random lexical inventions. I hope that I've lived up to my promise today to give you umpteen reflections on IHN. The key finding of my study is that these are not random inventions. Specific words emerge in specific discourse communities in a patterned way. Even where, as squillion, it's associated with childlike speech, this is a discursive convention, rather than a reflection of actual children's inventiveness. Whether we're talking about collegiate newspaper writers or Texas cowboys, these are informal and playful, yes, but they reflect distinct patterns of speech and writing, typical of specific communities. Finally, I suggested that in some cases, IHN may take a place in speakers' mental number line and become part of a number system, completing the cycle from definite to indefinite and back to definite reference. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
What comes after trillion?
Quadrillion?
That was anticlimactic.
Oh, I know, it's disappointing. Sure?
I had a question. It was delightful as expected. I was interested, you start off with this example of the prime ministerial candidate and how he got vilified for inappropriate usage in a discussion about health insurance, right? And that was very, very bad and went down a bad path. And I'm thinking about topics like that, like health insurance or debt, or where some of these unhappy things, might be discussed and how to choose there. Then I noticed there was some, I don't know if you call it patterning or if you could say more about it, like a lot of your examples, even though they were from different sources, were about the same kinds of things. Like some of them were from reviews that were about theater, a very fanciful kind of context. Even the ones that were about dressing, they weren't about this sort of utilitarian, utilitarian part of dressing. They were about the sort of more fanciful costuming part of dressing. You'll have, dressy frocks. You'll have this. You'll have that. They were about the fun part. So I was wondering if you could say something about sort of the mood of the speaker. If you've noticed things about sort of like whether this kind of business about not just sort of when you would use it per se, but some of these contexts, because I thought it was interesting that they were from theater or from
And
so
I absolutely agree that, and this is really one of my key arguments here is that they can be informal and they can be playful. But these are meant to be in most cases be understood as the writer or the speaker is playing with their audience, sometimes in a very knowing way.
But it seemed like health insurance. Maybe this was part of the problem.
It might have been a case that there was a discursive expectation that you're talking about the NHS, you should be more serious than that.
Right, but that's not a fun topic.
Right, it's not, and it was, there was certainly the discourse around that, and I have a whole collection of articles about what Nick Clegg said and what people said about Nick Clegg, had very much to do with, well, this guy is, he's like a child, he's an idiot who doesn't know anything about the economy because look at him using this word, squillion.
Yeah.
And I think even there they knew that he was of course being playful. But you're right. The sense was, well, you shouldn't be playful at this point. You should, in fact, be very serious.
Yeah, I think that part's really interesting.
Yeah.
Like to finance them. Like again, like just with this space race, where you're supposed to have a certain mood with the discourse.
Right.
The health insurance one just stood out to me about like that.
Right. Yeah.
There was I saw something on the ragtime slide that said a world and a half of Kankakee. I was wondering. That's the measure of the world and a half. It's kind of like saying to infinity and beyond, isn't it? Right there.
This one.
Before I go any further, I want to tell the world and a half of Kankakee that a few weeks ago.
I want to tell the world and a half of Kankakee, which I don't know what that is, but it's not a world and a half. I think it's a world and a half of Kankakee. It's still playful. I mean, it's a very colorful phrase, but I don't think and I would have to look and look into that phrase and see if a world and a half is being used in that idiomatic sense there.
But did you look for collocations of like a zillion and a half or a jillion and a half? Do those?
Oh yes, and I have like for each one, and one of the things about zillion is one of its collocations is with other numbers. And that's, those are phrases like a zillion and a half or 6 zillion or or a million, zillion, billion, or those are all within this category of numbers. There are actually only 5 examples with zillion and 4 with jillion that have that kind of structure. So we wouldn't be able to draw any broad conclusions about how frequent things like a zillion and a half might be, but because there are just too few instances for that to be meaningful. But it certainly is a category of thing that you can do with an IHN, is combine it with other numerals. In fact, part of the definition of an IHN is you have to be able to combine it with other numerals, or else it's something else entirely. Martha?
One question about high numerals with definite reference. They seem to me, especially when I hear people talk about the national debt, or they don't seem very definite. They seem fuzzy. I can't get my head around billion, or much less trillion. And I'm wondering if our difficulty in thinking about those enormous numbers might encourage the development of new alien words.
Right, and I think certainly for the major IHN that could be the case, because even a million is very hard for most people to conceptualize.
Yes.
Usually we can do 1,000 by imagining 10 by 10 by 10 cube. We can maybe think about 10,000 because $10,000 is meaningful to most of us, but even million has started to lose. It has a definite reference in the sense that you could write it out using using numerical notation, but in another sense, at a more pragmatic level, it gets very fuzzy very fast. And that's that. There's a recent article which I made a brief reference to by Eva Lavrich. There's a nice new book on hedging, and she has this on the use of definite hyperbolic numerals definite numerals in these hyperbolic indefinite ways. And I'd be happy to share that with you because it's really quite interesting. Yeah.
Why do you think the zillion is more popular now to be used with other prefixes than jillion? Do you think it's just phonological?
It might be. I think that's a hard question to answer. Why is it more popular? Just because of the number of instances expands by at least an order of magnitude after 1939. I don't have good data on what happens after 1939, and that's what we would really need to know. I actually don't have the slide here, but actually jillion was more popular than zillion until about the mid to late 1950s, just as an overall trend. And then really in the 60s, zillion took off at a greater rate than jillion.
When you say that it was more popular to the 50s, was that still more locally based?
No, basically after Runyon comes in, everything goes nuts. I mean, regionally speaking, or socially speaking. There's no link to a specific region that I've been able to find.
Do you think that there were more Ave speakers using zillion from the outset than regional speakers using jillion, and maybe their population diffusion?
It's hard to know. There are fewer zillions than jillions overall, so zillion's pretty rare. We do actually have pretty good corpora of African American newspapers. I've searched those quite thoroughly. I'm confident I haven't missed too many. I mean, there are obviously newspapers that haven't been digitized yet, and when they are, you can be sure I'll be doing that, or I'll hire some poor student to do that. Don't roll your eyes, Veronica. but I do think that, I mean, zillion is at only about 70% of them are African American, 30% aren't, whereas jillion is 94% are used in that sort of area of Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, Kansas, Nebraska. That's overwhelming. And so I think that probably jillion is the more concentrated one, and zillion is more fluid and more flexible. Nonetheless, there are no zillions in Texas, and there are no jillions in African American cities, or in African American newspapers in urban centers. Yes?
Well, you mentioned that in British English, the media is not as
1,000, no, a billion is not 1,000 million, but it's a million.
Right.
Just wanted to point it out that I don't know about all the Romance languages, but that's also the case for Spanish,
Correct.
which also doesn't have many of these zillion words. So when we say a billion, we mean a million. And when we say a trillion, we mean a million billion.
Right.
And with those numbers, you don't really need a lot of those, but I want to give you a new one for Spanish.
Ooh.
It rhymes. This is new. It's slang. It's kind of a youthful thing. My parents would never say that. It rhymes with millón, which is million, and it's called mogollón.
Mogollón.
Mogollón. That's
Oh, wow.
one that is right now being used.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you later.
Yes.
This is part of this cross-linguistic aspect. Is there's one article that basically emerges from the dialectological English aspect of it, but then more broadly, the cross-linguistic aspect is very important to me as I'm thinking about where these things come from and then where do they go, what happens to them over time.
And I wanted to ask you about this prefix, this ga, because as a foreigner earlier, this ga,
Gazillion.
What does that come from? What
Well,
is that?
no, originally I got really excited when I realized that zillion was African American, and I had this wild theory for about 2 weeks where I thought, well, clearly these are very common morphemes in a lot of African languages. Maybe ba, maybe these are some sort of Africanism. It's not, because African American publications never use bazillion, bajillion, gazillion. These are primarily used in non-African American contexts. They're just intensifiers that are essentially just phonological. But it's very clear that for most speakers, a zillion is less than a bazillion. Even though they're both indefinite, that bazillion must be even bigger. It's almost a meaningless intensifier when you're talking about how can one indefinite hyperbolic numeral be higher than another? But it's very clear that for most speakers, that's the case, that the baga, ka groupings are higher. Marius.
I have, it's not necessarily a joke, it's a context that I guess would lucratively prove that squillion is not no child talk. There's this famous Australian author, her name is Colleen McCullough. She's the author of The Romans, Thornbirds, etc.
Yep.
So supposedly she's a very rich woman. And it's exactly the supposition of Andrew Denton. He has this famous Australian show called Enough Rope. And he asked her about her financial situation. And her answer is kind of, meaning that, no, it's not great. And he says, why? You have made a squillion out of thornbirds. And she answers, well, mister, you will be surprised how many squeaks erode the squillion. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, and it's obvious that there are many, that Ilian is very productive and used in very many literary contexts. Regrettably, something I'd hoped to talk about, there's a very nice short story in the New Yorker that I shared with the chair of the anthropology department and is very meaningful to him because it is about the number that is so large that it kills people, and it's of course known as the Killian. And so this, this article, this story, the Killian, which I have shared with Tom, was this it's very productive and literary, and for the most part, these are literary productions. That they're not, including Squillian, and Skillion, even though they're associated with children's speech, they're not being written by children. And of course, we obviously don't know most of what children said and wrote. But I think that the fact that there's just that one, for basically 30 or 40 years, there's just Squillion, suggests that it's not actually children's speech, that it really is a literary usage that's emulative of children's speech. Liliana. Oh, do we have to wrap up, Walter?
No, I just want one question.
Oh.
Have you looked at the sort of Caribbean literature, like Alsop's dictionary of Caribbean English, or Jamaican, or Cassidy's dictionary of Jamaican English, right? I asked that because I'm wondering if there is a socioeconomic rationale for the zillion. In Caribbean English, I've been sort of going through my own knowledge of various Caribbean Englishes, and I get zillion all the time. I don't get anything else. And I know that from the Guyanese Creole sense perspective, zillion means it's something that is too much to count. We don't use anything else. The fact that African Americans seems to favor that one, and that African American and Caribbean people are usually socioeconomically less fortunate. I'm wondering if there is a socioeconomic principle that might play in there. I mean, that's what I was thinking as you were going along there.
And I do think that one of the things that is going on is that squillion is being used as almost a form of status emulation, looking to those who use these numbers as a matter of course. But I'm reluctant to, I think it's very interesting to raise this issue of the Caribbean Englishes. I don't know of evidence, but I'd be very interested to look into it. I think it would be very interesting to know. They're almost absent from British English until very, very late, regardless of social class. And so it would be, I'll have to think a little bit more. Most of these don't end up in dictionaries for the reasons I discussed earlier on.
As such dictionary.
All right, I'll do that.
I mean, I've got a copy. I'll look as soon as I leave here.
All right. Scott? I'm sorry, Liliana had a question.
Okay.
No?
Yeah, because they are kind of emphatic, and probably the prosody is usually emphasized in those. I'm wondering if it's just a coincidence that they tend to begin with a sibilant, with a hissing sound, which seems to, I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but also in Serbian, my family uses, now that you mentioned steen, in my family, I don't know if it's wider, but 16 is used as that minor numeral. So, and it's full of hissing sounds. It's shasnast, and it's pronounced with this very, emphatic thing. So you will say, oh, she has 16 colds. So it's that kind of, so I don't know, just
I certainly do think that there's a case to be made, and I think similarly, I don't think it's a coincidence that when you then add an intensifier onto them, that it starts with a plosive stop. And that's why when I ran the data, I just said, well, let's start with all the other. Let's take ba, ka, ga, and let's see what goes on with pa, ta, and da as the other obvious places from which there might be a new production in that regard. But I absolutely agree that with the fact that there are squillion and zillion and jillion as being these common ones, and the fact is that if I were to go run back a few slides, a few dozen slides, umpteen dozen even, that we do see other ones like skrillion and thrillion, I suppose, that you don't see